Today we'll be speaking on the topic of slave markets and the transatlantic slave trade of the United States. The transatlantic slave trade took place during 1501 to 1867, and the biggest players of the slave markets had slave markets set up in Europe, Africa, and the Americas, North and South. It was set up in a triangular method between the markets of the Americas, Europe, and Africa, which was done by traveling over the Atlantic Sea, which gave it its name, the transatlantic slave trade. As we can see in the graph, Africa on the right, South America, and North America on the top left. These were the routes frequently used by the slave traders themselves. The transatlantic slave trade was closely linked to slave markets, where European traders would purchase enslaved individuals from African slave traders. These enslaved people were then transported to the Americas, where they were sold at slave markets to plantation owners seeking labor. This system of buying and selling human lives not only fueled economic growth in Europe and the Americas, but also perpetuated deep social and racial inequalities that still resonate today.
Now, talking about the actual slave markets, we'll be starting with what it was like for slaves who were in them. Solomon Northup described his experience within a slave market. He begins by saying that they were all required to clean themselves up and shave if they had beards. They were then given clean clothes to wear. Man had a coat, hat, pants, and shoes. The women wore flocks of calico and handkerchiefs to bind around their heads. They were then taken to a large room where men and women split and were organized by height. They were threatened to look smart and act well before the auction. After eating lunch, they were then paraded around and made to dance. The next day, people came to examine them. They would ask to move them around, explain what they could do, and were physically examined, and some were even taken to be stripped and examined more closely. If a slave were to have scars from a whip on their backs, the customer would know that the person was either rebellious or not good at their job. At one point, a man was looking to buy Solomon, but his price was too high. This saddened Solomon, as the man lived in a city, so it would have been easier for him to escape. While he was not bought that day, others were. Quote, David and Coraline were purchased together by a Natchez planter. They left us, grinning broadly, and in the most happy state of mind, caused by the fact of their not being separated. Leth was sold to a planter of Baton Rouge, her eyes flashing with anger as she was led away. There was another man being purchased named Randall, whose mother Elijah begged for the whole family to be bought so they could stay together. But the man did not have the money to buy them all. This led her to becoming very emotional and crying, but her emotion was not something that Freeman tolerated, and he threatened her. She continued to beg that the three be bought together, but it was no use, and the deal was made. The mother and son were given one last embrace, where Randall said, Don't cry, Mama. I will be a good boy. Don't cry. Before going off, in the end, Solomon says that he would have cried too, had he dared. Now, this is a tragic story and is something that thousands of people went through. But there is something that separates this story from others. You see, Solomon Northup was a free black man born in Essex, New York in 1803. He was employed to drive a team south. On April 2nd, he made it to Washington City, which is now Washington, D.C., staying in Gadsby's hotel, where he fell ill shortly after. At some point, some people came to check on his condition and ended up giving him some medicine. The next thing that Northup remembers is being chained and handcuffed to William's slave pen, located in D.C. Eventually, he met James H. Birch, a slave dealer. Northup tried to explain that he was a free man, but he was stripped and whipped until he swore he would never admit to anyone that he was a free man. He was then kept in the slave pen for 10 days before he and the other slaves were chained together and put on a steamboat during the night. They were then taken down to New Orleans, where they were met by Theophilus Freeman, another slave dealer who had been a partner with Birch. They were then taken to another slave pen in New Orleans, where Northup fell ill with smallpox and was sent to the hospital, where he stayed for 2 weeks. When he left the hospital, Freeman wouldn't sell him to anyone in the area, and instead sold him to William Prince Ford, who resided in Rapids Parish, Louisiana, where he was taken and lived and worked as a carpenter for a little more than a year. Ford then sold Solomon to John Tibot, and he in a short time sold him to Edwin Epps in the Bayou Bayoff, about 130 miles from the mouth of Red River, reps held on to him from 1843. This all changed when a letter was received in August of 1852. Because of this letter, Henry Northup got help from the authorities and eventually tracked down and freed Solomon.
I will be telling you about Africa and the role it played in the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the markets it had within its borders. This is Marrakech, a city in Morocco known for its vibrant markets, stunning architecture, and rich history. However, beneath this vibrant facade lies a darker chapter, the slave market that once operated here. In the 16th to 19th centuries, Marrakech was a key hub in the trans-Saharan slave trade. The city served as a vital stop for traders who transported enslaved people from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and beyond. Enslaved individuals were brought here to be sold in bustling markets, often subjugated to unimaginable hardships and brutality. The heart of the slave trade in Marrakech was the bustling square known as Dijmal el-Fana, where buyers and sellers would gather. Here, people from diverse backgrounds would engage in commerce, but also, amongst the spices and textiles, the cries of those seeking freedom echoed unheard. The Taj Mahal and Fana was the melting point of cultures, yet it also served as a grim reminder of the city's involvement in human trafficking of the countless individuals it held. The enslaved people in question often came from regions in West Africa, such as present-day Mali, Senegal, and Niger. They were captured through raids, wars, or sold by local leaders. Some individuals were even enslaved as punishment for debts or crimes. The conditions of the slave markets were often brutal. Enslaved people faced physical and emotional trauma as they were displayed for sale. Families were frequently torn apart, and many endured long journeys under harsh conditions before even arriving in Marrakech. Once in Marrakech, enslaved people were sold for various roles. Domestic servants. These were often people employed in wealthy households performing tasks such as cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Laborers, on the other hand, worked in agriculture and construction, contributing to the economy of the city and the region. Finally, individuals were trained as soldiers, particularly in the context of the Moroccan military. All in all, the slave markets of Marrakech represent a complex intersection of trade, culture, and human suffering. By studying this history, we gain insight into the resilience of those who endured slavery and the ongoing journey towards justice and understanding.
The first slave market we're going to be discussing today is the European slave market. More notably, the countries that took a part of the European slave markets were Portugal, who are credited with being the first European country conducting slave business down in Africa, Britain, who at the peak of the transatlantic slave trade was the biggest in the game, and France, who followed Britain. But basically, the European slave market's role in the transatlantic slave trade was that of being the businessmen. What they would basically do was sell their top of the line wooden ships down to West Africa, conduct business with the West African and Central African leaders, acquire slaves, then transport them across the Atlantic to the Americas, where they would be auctioned off to and sold. At first, how the Europeans conducted business down in Africa was through friendly trading alliances with West and Central African leaders. Basically, what they would do is trade European goods like rare metals and rare cloths for prisoners of war who would be then turned into slaves and sold into slavery. However, when the demand for these slaves started to outweigh the supply, the Europeans were faced with a problem. And what they did was turn their friendly trading alliances into military ones and incited fighting in the region to create more instability, more conflict, more prisoners of war, and then in return, more slaves. While Britain was the biggest slave market in the transatlantic slave trade, it is only right to talk about how they got there. The port of Liverpool in England. At the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, Liverpool was sending nearly 3/4 of all the ships that were transporting slaves across the Atlantic. It is actually estimated that the ships leaving Liverpool carried nearly half of the 3 million transported by the British. Liverpool is an example of one of the many important slave markets in Europe.
Today I'm going to be talking about the American countries' involvement with the slave market and transatlantic slave trade. The American countries that were involved were the British, French, and Spanish colonies that later became the U.S., Caribbean islands, and South American countries. The British and French used enslaved Africans primarily as workers on plantations to work on crops like tobacco, sugar, and cotton, They basically treated them like as property with no rights at all, forcing them to work in the worst conditions ever. Now, as the years go by, New Orleans would end up being the biggest slave market in the U.S. with a size of over 135,000 slaves that were sold. It was also called the slave market of the South, and New Orleans did not confine its slave trade to a single market structure. What they would do was they would just sell the slaves citywide. Now, during 1619 and 1807, countries were trafficking and trading slaves left and right, until March 2nd, 1807, Congress in the U.S. made it illegal for Americans to engage in slave trade and gave U.S. authorities the right to seize slave ships, slavery would end up overall ending in 1865. And these were the slave ships that they would have the slaves in. Now, the reason countries in the U.S. would do this were for economic reasons and labor for farmers. The U.S. would make roughly over $600 million off of the slave market and trade.
Slave markets helped abolition, as many people in the North found it disgusting that people were selling other people. Many slaves were ripped from their families, friends, and homes, leading them to further despise their slavers. Former slaves like Solomon went on to describe how horribly they were treated, so more of the public would learn about the true horrors. Things like this helped fuel the push for abolition. The only thing that could be said about hurting abolition was that the slave trade helped fuel the Southern economy by allowing people to buy slaves to work. The people who benefited from the slave trade did not want to lose something that helped them.